You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have an update here as we're watching this back and forth between Donald Trump and Gavin Newsom, where Trump is trying to allow the National Guard and the Marines to stay in place here in Los Angeles, where I'm coming to you from, and Gavin Newsom is suing. Now, he was granted a temporary restraining order at the trial court. That was then stayed, meaning blocked temporarily in the appeals court. Donald Trump is hailing this as a win and using it to justify him being able to send the National Guard, being able to send U.S. troops into American cities. Is this a win for Donald Trump as he's claiming?
No, because it's what's called an administrative stay. In other words, we're just going to temporarily pause things without saying anything about the merits of the ruling by Judge Breyer. And the ruling by Judge Breyer could not have been clearer or more definitive. He said Donald Trump violated the federal law, Donald Trump violated the Constitution, and Donald Trump must relinquish control of the California National Guard, return it to Governor Gavin Newsom, quote, forthwith, translating that from legalese to English, right the F now. However, we've seen this happen over and over again, Brian, when there's this enormously consequential ruling handed down by a trial court judge. The Court of Appeals will grant what's called an administrative stay. Just put a temporary pause that has nothing to do and is not a criticism of Judge Breyer's opinion, while the parties can submit some briefs very quickly, and the appeals court, is requiring supplemental briefs to be filed on the 15th and the 16th of June, and then they're going to have the oral argument on the 17th, on Tuesday. So we're probably going to get an opinion from the Court of Appeals very quickly. But Brian, this is decidedly not a substantive win of any kind for Donald Trump.
Now, of course, the appeals panel that was drawn here is 2 Trump judges and 1 Biden judge. Does that color at all what you anticipate we're going to see from the appeals court? And again, if they did opt to overturn this ruling, it would be from a lower court that already ruled against Donald Trump and in California's favor.
Brian, I am not that concerned that 2 of the judges on the appeals court panel are Trump appointees. The reason I say that is because we now have a pretty clear track record of how judges have been voting in Trump-related litigation. Really, the most
even judges, by the way, who Trump himself appointed.
Not only that, it's Ronald Reagan appointed judges. It's George H.W. Bush appointed judges. It's George W. Bush appointed judges, and it is Trump appointed judges who are overwhelmingly ruling against Donald Trump. This is not only such a consequential issue, but Brian, it is such a clear-cut proposition of law. There were basically 4 things Donald Trump would have had to have done to comply with the federal law, and he did none of the 4. He had no basis to federalize and activate and seize control of the California National Guard. So, listen, I am fine with this 3-judge panel. I have a feeling they're going to get it right, and I think they're going to get it right quickly. But then, as we both know, the Supreme Court.
Right, and that's the thing at the end of the day. Even if they don't get it right, one side is going to appeal, because if the 3-judge panel rules alongside the trial court judge, then the Trump administration is going to appeal this yet again to the Supreme Court. And of course, if they rule in Trump's favor and overturn the lower court's ruling, then California is going to appeal up to the Supreme Court. So isn't it almost moot at this point what the appeals court decides to do, because the Supreme Court is going to be the final arbiter of things here?
I wouldn't say it's moot. I would say it will be instructive to see what the 3-judge panel does, how it rules, the opinion that the judges write. It will have some impact on how the Supreme Court justices assess the case. I don't think they ignore opinions and rulings from the courts of appeal.
Well, two of them do.
Fair enough. I mean, listen, Brian, we can always write off the votes of, Sammy the Bull Alito and Clarence Thomas. I just wish they would both pile into Clarence Thomas's $250,000 mobile home, given to him by a Republican billionaire and just take a permanent vacation. I would be content to have them just call in their 2 votes in favor of whatever Donald Trump wants to do in any case. But here's the thing, because we're going to have to evaluate what the Supreme Court might do, and I am of 2 minds there. One, they seem forever to be inclined to find ways to rule for Donald Trump, even if it means finding a workaround to the express language of the Constitution. They did it in the presidential immunity case. But the other thing that has given me some hope, and I would even call it a point of light shining out of the Supreme Court, which doesn't often happen, is in 3 cases now, all having to do with the due process rights of immigrants, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Constitution, in favor of due process rights for all. And the vote, which is perhaps most important, one was unanimous, 9-0. Not quite sure how Alito and Thomas, let themselves vote against the Trump administration, but they did, 9-0. And then the next 2 were 7-2 in favor of due process and 7-2 in favor of due process. That's a track record I like to see. I'll take 7 justices voting in favor of the Constitution and against Donald Trump any day of the week. And I just hope that is a trend that continues. And what I want to believe, Brian, even if I don't know whether I believe it or not, I want to believe that with Donald Trump's continued overreach, abuse of power, abuse of office, lawlessness, and unconstitutionality, sending troops into the streets to be turned against the citizenry, that's something that I do think will catch the attention of all 9 Supreme Court justices. And I have to hope that all of that is going to work against Donald Trump when the Supreme Court finally gets this California case.
Glenn, this is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, is that correct?
It is.
So it's worth noting that even if we get a ruling from this 3-judge panel, which again is 2 Trump appointees and 1 Biden appointee, even if we get a ruling that would overturn the lower court's ruling in Trump's favor here, couldn't the state of California just appeal for en banc review, meaning the entire Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is actually 16 judges who were appointed by Democrats and 13 that were appointed by Republicans. So this is a Democrat-leaning appeals court. And so presumably, even if this court doesn't rule in California's favor, they do have a much more favorable full court at their disposal if they need it. And that would be beneficial because then moving forward, at least that's precedent. Because once you have this ruling handed down by an appeals court, that actually creates the precedent.
Yeah, procedurally, you're exactly right. But now I'm going to fall back on something you said a few minutes ago, which is that even if California is successful in asking the full court, en banc, to revisit a ruling that they lost in front of the 3-judge panel, if that's what ends up happening, it is all kind of academic because it's still going to end up in the Supreme Court. I'm not saying that the state of California should leapfrog that procedural opportunity to have the entire bench decide whether what Donald Trump did is unlawful and unconstitutional. Again, there might be some nice atmospheric value in having all of the judges, maybe but for the couple of Trump appointees, say, no. Judge Breyer got it exactly right. Donald Trump acted lawlessly and unconstitutionally. There might be some value in that. But again, all academic because we know it's going to end up before the Supreme Court.
Right, I completely agree. There is the slight possibility that the Supreme Court opts not to weigh in, and in that case, the only precedent that would be established here that would stand would be a decision handed down by the appeals court. So it's still good, regardless, to know that in the event that this 3-judge panel doesn't rule in favor of California, at their disposal is still the full court that is leaning Democratic and could still hand down a ruling that if the Supreme Court, on the off chance they decide not to rule, that would then become the precedent.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I would say on the off chance the Supreme Court opts not to take up this case that is, enormously consequential for Donald Trump, what are the odds of that? I would say slim to none, and slim is probably fading fast.
Well, Glenn, let's talk about the 30,000-foot view here. And I want to discuss both possibilities with you. Can you speak about the implications if A, the Supreme Court decides to rule in Trump's favor and basically allows him carte blanche to send the U.S. military into American cities, even in the case of California, where they didn't meet the qualifications for this rule. I believe it was U.S. Code Title 10, Section 14206. That's how many videos I've done on this issue that I can actually pull out the code number. But there has to be a rebellion, there has to be an invasion, and there has to be a failure for the government to be able to execute the laws. None of those things are satisfied. And so what would the implications be if the Supreme Court says, you know what, screw what the plain text of the Constitution says, we're going to allow Donald Trump carte blanche to do whatever he wants? And then the flip side, what would the implications be if they do decide to rule in favor of California and uphold these rulings stating that Donald Trump does not have carte blanche to be able to send in the U.S. military against American citizens?
Yeah, Brian, let me start with the easier of the two answers to your two questions. If the Supreme Court agrees with Judge Breyer that a federal law must be followed by the president and the president is not entitled to violate the 10th Amendment to the Constitution by usurping, basically stealing the state's rights from them, then all is good, because then the status quo will be maintained, with that status quo being a president is bound by the laws of our nation and by our Constitution. That's the easy one. The hard one is, what if the Supreme Court says Donald Trump can federalize the National Guard, not only of California, but by extension, every state in the Union and the District of Columbia, even if there is no predicate, even if he can't satisfy the law that is in place to make sure a president doesn't overreach and violate the state's rights and the Constitution? That will mean it is now the militarization of the United States of America on the whim of an aspiring dictator, because there will be a completely unconstrained ability of the president to federalize National Guardsmen, National Guardswomen anywhere he wants with no basis whatsoever. That will be the militarization of the United States of America. And I would expect to see, in essence, soldiers, the National Guard, in the streets in all 50 states doing what? Basically trying to deter Americans from exercising their constitutional rights of, for example, free speech and the right to peaceably assemble and petition our government for a redress of our grievances. And boy, we got some grievances.
Well, obviously, all of that underscores the fact that the stakes are especially high right now. I do have to eat a little bit of crow because it was section 12406, not 14206, but close enough. With that said, obviously, things are moving very quickly here, and we will keep an eye on what happens both with this appeals court panel, whether it gets sent over to en banc review for the full appeals court to review it, and when the Supreme Court ultimately has their say on this issue. And this is unfolding in real time. Again, I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, where we have troops in the streets right now. I just saw them, just not even 2 hours ago when I was outside. So, this is all kind of coming to bear in real time. So we will, of course, stay on top of this issue. For those who are watching, if you'd like to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.